Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Breakfast Club. We hope you're all doing okay. We are back with return guest, Dr. Rayna Bell. Hey, Rayna.
Hi.
So Breakfast Club viewers will know you from, last time you were here, you did a virtual tour of the herpetology collections, which was incredibly cool with our collections manager, Lauren Scheinberg. And then time before that, you took us to, everywhere really, because you were doing kind of a 101 on amphibians and reptiles. Which was awesome. And if you missed either of those viewers, you can find them both in our Breakfast Club playlist, which I'll drop into the comment section. Today, you are going to give some relief, although it's also kind of heartbreaking relief, to everybody who feels stuck at home and can't travel and wants to see new sites, but isn't able to. You're going to kind of take us around the world. Can you tell us where?
Yeah, so we will be traveling virtually to the Gulf of Guinea archipelago, which is off the coast of West Central Africa.
Okay, excellent. And if you are someone who hasn't seen a lot of green lately, this will be good for your eyeballs. And let's see, I'm going to kind of let you just get into it because I also want to see this presentation and haven't before. But I will remind people watching that you can ask Rayna questions anytime by leaving them in the comment section of Facebook or the chat box of YouTube. And we'll loop back at the end to ask her. So let me give you your slides. And yeah, thank you so much again for coming back, and we will see you at the end.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so thanks everyone for joining us. And I'm really excited because I'm going to be sharing highlights of a nearly 2-decade project that involves so many people at the California Academy of Sciences. And a lot of this work that I'm going to share with you today was made possible by many long-term supporters of the Academy. So a big thank you to everyone who's been involved in this project over the years and everyone who's been supporting us along the way. So to set the scene, the pace of life in the African island nation of São Tomé Príncipe, which, as I just mentioned, is off the coast of West Central Africa. And so the pace of life in this island nation is perhaps best encapsulated by their local saying, which is lev lev, which roughly translates to slow and easy. So it's a very relaxed and beautiful culture and place to visit. And so this country has a total population of just around 200,000 people. And under non-COVID times, just a few flights a week between the capital of São Tomé Island, or on São Tomé Island, and Lisbon in Portugal. But of course, that's been much reduced more recently. And again, even in pre-COVID times, daily life in this equatorial country is pretty quiet and pretty uninterrupted. And it's been that way for many decades. And so this is a scene from the capital city. And because of this, much of the island's natural habitats remain more or less intact. And the islands host some of the highest levels of endemism, or species that are found nowhere else in the world. And so over the last several decades, there have been ongoing surveys to pinpoint offshore oil reserves, explorations to potentially build a deep water port. And so the São Toméans have been facing this challenge of reconciling the potential for rapid economic development with preserving their natural heritage. And against this backdrop, there's been this major issue that no one knows for sure how many species occupy the islands and how irreplaceable that diversity might be. And so that is what initially inspired this island biodiversity race. So for the past 2 decades, now Emeritus Curator Robert Drews at the California Academy of Sciences has been leading a team of biologists in a race, more or less, to document biodiversity on the islands. And so far, the Academy team and partners have recorded hundreds of species of plants, animals, and fungi, dozens of which are new to science and can only be found on a single island in the archipelago. And so this is just like a smattering of scientific publications that have resulted from this work. And so even though we're starting to make a dent in describing and documenting the island's biodiversity, the lifestyles for most of these species are largely unknown, and this can be really problematic for conservation planning. So this is the Príncipe giant tree frog, one of the largest tree frog species in the world. And so far, its breeding site and what its tadpoles look like haven't been documented. And this is very basic information that is necessary to identify the habitats that this species relies on and to make sure that those habitats are maintained into the future. And it's not that we haven't been searching actively for these tadpoles, we have, but it turns out it's pretty challenging to search for something that you've never seen before and you don't know where to look and you don't have a good search image of what it is that you're looking for. And if you're not aware of this from your herpetology background knowledge or amphibian biology background knowledge, frog eggs and their tadpoles can develop in a ton of different types of environments, not just necessarily the ponds or streams that you might be used to, which is more typical of our North American species. And in particular, tropical species of frogs have really diverse modes by which their offspring develop. And so you have to search high and low for potential sites that the eggs and the tadpoles might be deposited. And so far we have struck out. And so even on a relatively small island like Principe, where the species occurs, finding the tadpoles is actually a quest or a real challenge. So this is just to show you one of the more extreme sites that we searched, this really beautiful waterfall. And we did find the adults of the species around this site, but we struck out as every other trip that we've been on and didn't find any tadpoles here. And so finding those tadpoles and learning more about how to ensure their survival is one of my many sort of long-term scientific goals now that I am the Curator of Herpetology at the Academy and continuing this project that Robert Drew started many decades ago. So this morning I'm going to share some of the most exciting scientific discoveries from, again, nearly 2 decades of expeditions to the islands. And these expeditions have been undertaken by a team that studies everything from moss, which are my main research focus. And then I'll end with the sort of central aim of the biodiversity race, which is communicating our results to the island's residents. And so I'm going to share some of the ways in which our discoveries are making an impact on a local and international scale. So first, let's get oriented to the Gulf of Guinea Islands. So the first island in the archipelago is Bioko Island, and this island is actually part of the continental shelf. And so the volcanoes that comprise the peaks of the island arose about 1 to 3 million years ago. And over this history, changes in sea level have resulted in several periods where those mountain peaks were isolated and then periods where they were connected with the rest of the continent. And so what that means is that continental diversity didn't necessarily have to disperse overseas to reach the island. The other islands in the archipelago are Principe, São Tomé, and Annobon. And these islands arose as volcanoes from the ocean floor. And so they've never been connected to the continent, and all of the diversity that is there results from overseas dispersal. So they're the descendants of plants, animals, and fungi that dispersed overseas and reached the islands. And so from a biologist perspective, this is a really exciting place to study evolution because we have very different geological histories between these islands. And then I've also put the ages of the volcanoes that form the islands on this slide. And so you can see there's a broad range of times that these islands have been above sea level. And so there's just a lot of interesting comparisons that we can look at in terms of how endemism and biodiversity accumulate through time. And then one of the other things that I think is really amazing about this particular archipelago is that it's relatively close to the continent. And because of that, there's a lot of potential sources of dispersers. And so unlike really famous archipelagos that you are probably aware of, like Hawaii and the Galapagos, which are relatively young and isolated, this particular archipelago, the Gulf of Guinea archipelago, is really interesting because it's much older and it's also closer to continental sources. And so there's just been a lot more opportunity for dispersal events to happen and a lot more potential sources for those dispersers to come from. And so this morning, I'll just be focusing on Principe and São Tomé Islands because that's where the Academy has focused its efforts. But as a whole, I think this entire archipelago is really fascinating. So the islands were of São Tomé and Príncipe were uninhabited when the Portuguese colonized them in the 1500s or so, and they established sugar plantations across the islands with a workforce of enslaved Africans. So a bit later after this time, biologists started to describe the Gulf of Guinea biodiversity, still under this colonial period. And most of the endemic vertebrate animal species, so fishes, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, received scientific names in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Then in the 1940s, a catalog of vascular plants was published by the British Museum of Natural History, in which they described many of the endemic plants for the islands. But other than these major efforts, the sort of less obvious or less charismatic groups like spiders and snails and fungi and mosses didn't really receive scientific attention in this early period of biodiversity research. And on top of that, many of the original reference scientific collections of the vertebrate animals were lost or destroyed in a fire at Lisbon's Natural History Museum in the 1970s. So there was sort of this early period of biodiversity documentation, and then a lot of that material, unfortunately, was lost. So starting in 2001, Bob Drews, again, who I mentioned at the beginning, organized multiple expeditions to São Tomé and Príncipe to improve the knowledge or biodiversity knowledge of all the organisms, but especially the ones that hadn't received much attention from earlier explorers. And so I don't have time to share everything that we've learned since those first expeditions, but I'm going to share a couple of highlights. And I'll start with the marine and intertidal habitats. So one of the Academy's coral biologists, Gary Williams, studies non-reef building corals, and these are called octocorals or sea fans, and they actually happen to be quite abundant in the Gulf of Guinea. So in collaboration with barnacle biologists at San Francisco State University, this team described 2 new species of barnacle, and here we have a zoom to show you what they look like. And these barnacles grow exclusively on these sea fan octocorals. And there's one barnacle species that grows on many different types of sea fans, and then another barnacle species that is specialized on just one type of sea fan. And so this leads to a bunch of currently unanswered questions about how these barnacles pick their specific hosts, and then also why some barnacle species are generalists in their hosts and why others are specialists. When Academy echinoderm expert Rich Moy visited the islands, he was in search of these rotula sand dollars, and sand dollars is in quotes here. I'll explain that in a second. And so these sand dollars exclusively occur in the Gulf of Guinea, but they weren't officially documented from São Tomé and Príncipe. And so this is a species that lives in really high wave energy environments, so really turbulent, choppy wave breaks. And so it makes it pretty dangerous to snorkel to search for the live animals. But of course, they wash up on the shore. So we have many representatives that washed up on shore in the collection. But what this means is that we know very little about their lifestyles, including how they position themselves in the sand and why they have these holes and sort of this interesting kind of frilly half of their skeleton. We don't know whether that part is pointed upright or tucked into the sand and why they have that particular structure compared to other sand dollars. And the echinoderm tree of life is still very much a work in progress. But it turns out that these rotula sand dollars are not closely related to the true sand dollars in the Caribbean that also have holes in their shells. And so it looks like the holes in these sand dollars are a case of convergent evolution with the Caribbean species that look similar but are actually not closely related. So several Academy ichthyologists, including multiple curators and collection manager, have surveyed both the marine and the freshwater fishes of São Tomé and Príncipe. And these islands have a pretty diverse fish community, with just over 250 species documented so far. But the diversity is still very much underdocumented. And the team has added dozens of new species records to the sort of growing checklist. And they've also described several new species, including this really beautiful parrotfish. And in the decade or so since this marine team has started surveying, they've started to notice that large predatory fish species are becoming less common, and in general that they're finding smaller individuals and less abundant fishes when they're out surveying. And so these tend to be signs of non-sustainable fishing practices and a potential indicator that these practices are starting to impact local fisheries. So now we'll transition to terrestrial habitats. And like Laurel said, lots of green coming your way. So as you might imagine, tropical forests are very hospitable to non-vascular plants. So those are plants like mosses and lichens and liverworts. And these types of plants are also very good long-distance dispersers. So they have spores that can be dispersed by the jet stream, which is pretty amazing. And so what that means is that for them to disperse to a new place, they just have to land in the right humid spot to establish. And so our bryophyte team, pictured here, can find up to 15 or 20 species on a single tree if they're in a really good site. And so they might spend hours collecting representatives from just a few meters of habitat. And because this is one of the groups that was sort of skipped over in that sort of early biodiversity documentation period in the colonial time, this team has added over 100 new species to the known flora of the islands, just because there wasn't really an effort to systematically survey that diversity in those earlier efforts. So vascular plants, by contrast, are one of the more studied groups from the islands, but there's still some very general things about their biology that aren't documented yet. And so, for example, here we have Academy botanist Tom Daniel, who's pointing to a plant that is endemic to São Tomé. And even though it has these large, colorful flowers, he doesn't know yet who pollinates them, which is interesting because usually when you have really elaborate flowers, it suggests that they've evolved to attract a particular kind of pollinator. And then another sort of unexpected plant that occurs on Príncipe Island this time. This is a mycoheterotroph, and these plants are red because they don't do photosynthesis, and instead they steal their nutrients from fungi. So this plant was the first of its family to be found on one of the Gulf of Guinea islands, and it was an unexpected find because even though they occur on the continent of Africa in Cameroon, which is sort of adjacent to the islands, they lack obvious structures for either wind or animal dispersal of their seeds. So unlike the mosses and bryophytes that are really good dispersers, this isn't the type of plant that biologists would consider, or botanists would consider to be a high dispersal species. So before the Gulf of Guinea expeditions began, only a handful of mushroom species were known to science from these islands. And so another colleague from San Francisco State University, Denis Desjardins, and his team recorded more than 200 species of fungi on the expeditions that they participated in, and about 60 to 80 of which, from his perspective, which he's a renowned mushroom biologist, he thinks those are likely new to science. And just for context, researchers or mushroom researchers typically describe about 25 new species or so a year for the entire world. So finding 60 to 80 potentially new species from 2 really small islands is a very big deal in the mushroom community. So Dennis and his colleagues have already completed the scientific descriptions for many of these new species, and there are several more in the works. And then I just wanted to draw your attention, in case you haven't noticed yet. In the lower left, we have a pair of photos that are documenting bioluminescence in one of the mushroom species. And so bioluminescence is documented in many different types of mushrooms, but the function is very poorly understood. And just as someone who's stumbled across bioluminescent mushrooms in the forest, it's totally magical. And I wish it upon everyone to stumble across this. It's really amazing, even if we have no idea why they do it. Super cool. So one of the most exciting discoveries for Academy arachnologists was a sheet web tarantula on São Tomé Island. And so the one pictured here is a South African species, just because it's a better photo, but the São Tomé one looks similar. And so what's really interesting about this particular tarantula is that it has a kleptoparasite smaller species, which there's a little arrow here pointing at it in case you hadn't noticed it already. And so this smaller spider species lives on the web of the tarantula, and it feeds on the bigger spider's prey. And so as far as arachnologists know, these little spiders can't produce their own sticky capture silk, and so they're fully dependent on the tarantula's hunting skills. And what's particularly exciting about this discovery on São Tomé Island is that the whole ecosystem, this micro ecosystem of a host and a kleptoparasite, likely arrived as a unit. And probably not through the typical ballooning long distance dispersal that most island spiders are capable of. And basically they have a silken line that they put up and it's caught by the wind. And so they disperse via ballooning, it's called. And so that doesn't seem like a possible explanation for this little micro ecosystem of spiders. And instead it suggests that they probably rafted there together. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So the butterflies of the islands have been extensively studied by a Portuguese colleague who just completed a new book on the butterflies of São Tomé and Príncipe. And after several expeditions and many, many years of work, Louise, our colleague, has refined the diversity and distributions of over 100 known species, of which a third are endemic to one or both of the islands. So for a long time, it was thought that bats were the only endemic mammals on São Tomé and Príncipe, and that the shrews that occur on the islands must have colonized as stowaways when humans first arrived. But recent research conducted by Portuguese colleagues again, Ricardo Lima and Luis Seriaco, have confirmed that the shrews on the islands are endemic and that each island has its own endemic species. And so if you're not familiar with shrews, these are really small animals that have to eat every few hours. They have a really high metabolism. And so again, kind of like the kleptoparasite spider, these are not considered to be high dispersal potential animals. And they're typically not the sort of animal that you would expect would be able to disperse and establish on an oceanic island by themselves. So this is a pretty exciting bird story. So after over a decade of work by many colleagues, we finally have confirmation of a new owl species on Príncipe Island. And so there were many years of rumors and speculation. There is an owl on São Tomé Island, but there wasn't one documented on Príncipe Island. And so colleagues Martin Mello and Martin Dahlemer recorded the calls of what they thought was a Scops owl on Príncipe in about 2009. And then in 2016, colleagues Felipe Spina and Felipe Verbelin photographed it. So 7 years later. And then Martin has since captured and banded a few individuals and is working with a student to describe the new species and gather really important information about its conservation status. And describing a new species of owl is not something that happens very often. So this is a really exciting discovery for science and for conservation. So here is a sampling of the terrestrial reptiles from the two islands. And we have a few types of reptiles that we, again, wouldn't expect to find on an oceanic island. And this includes limbless lizards, which is shown here on the left, and burrowing snakes, which are shown on the bottom right. And so many of these reptile species were poorly known to science before the Academy expeditions, and several new species have since been described, and there are a couple more in progress. And I'll just note in the bottom left, in case you're wondering what that is a realistic photo of what a cobra looks like when you happen across one in the forest. So these occur on São Tomé Island, and you definitely need to be watching where you walk, keeping an eye out for snakes basking in the sun. So I've shared a whole suite of biological stories that are waiting to be uncovered for basically every group of organisms in the Gulf of Guinea. But what initially drew me to these islands was the presence of so many species of amphibians. And so unlike Darwin's finches or the Galapagos tortoises, in which many species evolved from one common ancestor, in São Tomé and Príncipe, the amphibians come from many different families. And so that indicates that overseas dispersal has happened more than once. And again, amphibians tend to be a group that we don't consider to be very successful dispersers across saltwater barriers. So it's very exciting that this has happened so many times in this particular archipelago. And in case you're wondering what these limbless yellow animals are across the bottom, these belong to a group of amphibians called caecilians that only occur in the tropics. And most caecilian species have very secretive underground lifestyles, and so we don't know very much about their biology. But the São Tomé caecilian is unique in that it spends a lot of time at the surface, and because it's bright yellow, the São Toméans know them very, very well, and they call them cobra bobo. And I have a quick video to show you a little bit more about what they are like, because they're super interesting. So when we visit communities to do our surveys, in particular here to look for amphibians, we ask for permission if we can access their land, and then often they're very interested to come with us and ask all sorts of really good questions about the work that we're doing. And in this particular community in Bombaim, they're very familiar with cobra bobo because they regularly encounter them in their fields. And so here we were led directly to a cobra bobo that sort of nestled around the really soft soil that surrounds the agricultural fields that they're constantly working in. And as you can see, they're just thrilled to share a cobra bobo with us. And it took, 5 minutes maybe to find one. So for caecilian biologists who study the more elusive and hard to find species, this is just a really special treat to be able to come to a place like São Tomé and find a caecilian within just a couple of minutes. So if you're interested in seeing caecilians, I highly recommend visiting São Tomé because it's basically guaranteed that you'll see one. Okay, so now we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into what we know about some of the island's amphibians. So as I've been sharing so far this morning, this archipelago hosts really unique biodiversity of plants and animals. And again, because the islands have never been connected to continental Africa, all of this unique diversity is descended from continental species that had to first disperse overseas to get there. And this is true of all oceanic islands. And because of this, animals that are poor dispersers across saltwater, like frogs and shrews and kleptoparasite spiders, they tend to be absent from oceanic islands. And the Gulf of Guinea Islands are unique in a way because they host a lot of animals and plants that aren't supposed to be on islands, based on this sort of central understanding of what types of organisms are and are not good dispersers. And so the puzzle of how all these sort of unexpected species or types of organisms made it to the islands is what initially drew me in as an evolutionary biologist. And so as I hinted at with the spiders, the main hypothesis for how all these poor dispersing plants and animals would have reached the islands is by rafting. And so this is sort of an artist's reconstruction of what this would look like. It's a little bit dramatized, but the idea is that large pieces of vegetation would sort of cluster together in a raft or a mat that floats on the surface, or you could potentially have a big chunk of riverbank that breaks off and gets swept out to sea, and that this raft or riverbank chunk would sort of have an entire mini ecosystem on it that would get dispersed to the islands all at once, sort of seeding a whole new suite of plants and animals from the continent. And so these large vegetation rafts or river chunks, or riverbank chunks, sorry, would get swept out to sea from really large river drainages. And there are 3 large rivers that flow into the Gulf of Guinea and near the islands that could potentially serve as sources of these rafts. So there's the Niger River, the Congo River, and the Ogooué River, and they're all highlighted here. The rivers are larger, I just couldn't fit them all on the map, but they extend across a really large part of the continent. So the alternative hypothesis is that colonization would proceed by island hopping from the mainland to the first island in the chain, and then from one island to the next. And so we can differentiate among these different hypotheses by identifying the mainland species that are most closely related to the island endemics and whether they occur along these rivers. And then we can also reconstruct the relationships among island species to see if they follow this island hopping pattern of dispersal from one island to the next. And we can also use genetic tools to get a general estimate of when in the long history of these islands these dispersal events would have occurred. And so I was very curious about the history of every single endemic species, and I still am, and whether they have shared or different colonization histories. But of course, you have to start somewhere. And so I narrowed down my search initially to focus just on the evolutionary history of the island's reed frogs, the giant reed frog and the Muller's reed frog. And because reed frogs occur on both São Tomé and on Príncipe, and there are multiple species of reed frog, I thought this was a really exciting group to start with because I could ask questions beyond just how and when these frogs got to the islands, but also how did they continue to evolve once they reached the islands. So using genetic tools, I identified that the cinnamon belly reed frog, whose distribution on continental Africa here is shown in blue, is the most closely related reed frog species on the African continent. And then the distribution of this species, as you can see, doesn't overlap with the Niger River. And so that sort of rules out the Niger River as a potential colonization route to the islands. And then the cinnamon belly reed frog is not found on Bioko Island, the first island in the chain. And so that sort of rules out this island hopping hypothesis as well. But because this species has a pretty broad distribution across the continent and it overlaps with the Congo and the Ogooué rivers, it means that either of these rivers could potentially serve as a dispersal route to the islands. And so to get at this in a little bit more detail, I sampled populations of the cinnamon belly reed frog across the distribution of the species. And I found that the frogs along the Ogooué River were the closest genetic match to the island endemics. And when I estimated the dispersal time, or the timing of which the dispersal would have occurred, it was relatively recent from an evolution perspective. It was in the last couple million years. And that's recent. And again, considering that São Tomé Island is 13 million years and that Príncipe Island is 30 million years old. So these early arrivers arrived on São Tomé Island about 2 to 3 million years ago. And then they continued to evolve once they reached São Tomé. And this resulted in 2 endemic reed frog species, the Muller's reed frog and the giant reed frog. And then one of those, the Muller's reed frog, dispersed overseas to reach Príncipe Island. And so this project, clear history of the order in which the reed frogs colonized the islands, which incidentally is the reverse order that we would expect for this island hopping hypothesis, where the island that is further from the continent was colonized first. And it also, again, indicated that this event happened relatively recently in the island's much older geological histories, which I think is really fascinating because it suggests that these islands are still accumulating new species and generating endemism. We tend to think of islands as they have these old endemic species on them, but evolution is this ongoing process. And so old islands are still continuing to generate new diversity. And so this study also produced some other unexpected results that I'll share with you briefly. So first, we found that when the 2 species on São Tomé, again, the Muller's reed frog and the giant reed frog, when they are neighbors, they hybridize extensively. So here I'm showing some sites on São Tomé where I collected genetic data from the Muller's reed frog in yellow and the giant reed frog in pink. And so you may have noticed from the photos I've been sharing that these species differ in coloration. They also differ in body size and in the types of breeding sites that they select to deposit their eggs. Again, tropical frog species are notorious for this sort of diversity. So the giant reed frog breeds in water-filled tree cavities in primary forest. And the Muller's reed frog is more of a city reed frog. It breeds in open and disturbed habitats, including in people's backyards. And so in spite of these differences in their behavior and their morphology, we found that they interbreed extensively when their ranges overlap. And so that's indicated by these orange sites on the map. And here's what some of those hybrid individuals look like. So you can see that they have the sort of intermediate coloration pattern of the 2 parental species. And so this hybrid zone raises a bunch of questions, including whether the frogs can tell each other apart and whether the hybrid individuals are less fit than the parental species, which is something that we often see in hybrid zones, but it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes there's no consequence to being a hybrid, and sometimes the hybrids are even more fit than the parents. Another piece of this puzzle is that it looks like hybridization is a fairly recent phenomenon, and that's because it looks like it coincides with agricultural development at the edge of the primary forest. And so here I am in the middle of the hybrid zone with some colleagues, and this is the type of habitat that we tend to find the hybrids in. And usually they're breeding in sort of artificial, either water-filled tarps that are being used to water the agricultural fields, or cisterns. So sort of non-natural water features in these heavily modified landscapes. So I've been returning to São Tomé over the last couple of years to increase my sampling across the island to get a better idea of the temporal and geographic extent of hybridization between these species and whether it always does coincide with agricultural development or whether this is just a coincidence in the one place that I've looked at this more closely so far. And so I'm hoping that this work will provide some clues as to how the species split into 2 in the first place, And then also whether development on the islands is increasing the rate of hybridization and whether that's something that we need to be monitoring more closely moving forward. So the second somewhat unexpected result from my genetic study was that the populations of Muller's reed frog on the 2 islands were completely genetically distinct. And so that's shown here by these yellow and blue sites where I've collected genetic data for the different populations. And when I looked more closely at specimens in the Cal Academy's collection, I found physical differences between frogs on the 2 islands as well. And so this sort of thing happens to taxonomists all the time. It's one of the reasons that we collect scientific specimens so that we can study them more closely in the lab if we get an unexpected genetic result. And so what this work demonstrates is that although reed frogs dispersed between the islands at some point in the history of the islands, there's no ongoing migration between these populations now. And so they're on separate evolutionary trajectories, or they have separate stories now. And that's why they're starting to accumulate these genetic and physical differences. And so I had the distinct honor of being able to name the new species after Bob Drews in honor of the work that he's done in these islands for the last 2 decades, and in particular in his efforts to draw attention to some of the more neglected aspects of biodiversity from a scientific perspective in this archipelago. So there are lots of aspects of these reed frogs biology that we still know very, very little about, even though now they're one of the better known groups of species from the Gulf of Guinea archipelago. So we're just starting to get an idea of who some of their main predators are. And I'm really looking forward to more expeditions with the arachnology curator at the Academy, Lauren Esposito, to better understand predator-prey interactions between spiders and reed frogs on São Tomé and also elsewhere. This is sort of an unappreciated aspect of spider biology, is that yes, they do often eat vertebrate prey. And then I've also been recording the mating calls of these 3 species and the hybrid males. And in part, that's because mating calls are considered to be a really important part of the speciation or diversification process in frogs. So males of each species produce distinct calls for most frogs, and that's true in this group of frogs as well. But we don't know whether females have a preference for calls of their own species, and the large number of hybrid frogs that I've been finding suggests that they may not. And so I actually have a recording I'll try to play for you. Oh, I put my call in a very unfortunate place where I can't, let's see. Nope. Okay, well, you'll just have to trust me that their calls sound a little different. But even the females have a hard time telling them apart because I've been finding a lot of hybrid individuals, like I said. And so that suggests that they may not have a preference, or maybe they can't really tell these different species apart based on their calls. And so what I'm interested to do next is some behavioral research to test how females respond to male calls of the different species and the calls of hybrid males, which I've demonstrated are intermediate between the calls of the Muller's reed frog and the giant reed frog, and to see how females respond and whether they do or don't have a preference for different call types. And then I'm also curious to test the preference of the female reed frogs on Príncipe Island, because that's the species that's shown at the top of the page here. And as you can see, even if you're not a frog call specialist, that one's call is quite different from the other 2 species. So it is producing calls with many, many notes all in a row. And so I'm curious to see whether the females of this species have a preference for calls that have multiple notes in them compared to the females on the other islands. All right, So there are many other species of amphibians on the islands, as I've alluded to, and we know even less about these species than we do about the reed frogs, starting from their biogeographic history. So when did they colonize the islands and from where? And all sorts of questions about their ecology, their behavior, and their conservation needs. So I have a lot to keep me busy, probably for the next 2 decades or so of work. Okay, so now I'm going to wrap up by telling you about how we're working to make an impact by transferring the knowledge that has been and is still being gathered by scientists about the biodiversity in the Gulf of Guinea. So the first major outreach effort started in 2011 when the Academy designed biodiversity posters with a very simple message. There are plants and animals here that are found nowhere else in the world. And so with these posters and the subsequent projects that I'll be sharing with you, the goal is to impart a feeling of stewardship without dictating how these resources should be managed. And so on this particular trip, educator Roberta Ayres learned that because the school curriculum in São Tomé comes from Portugal, for the life sciences curriculum, students were learning about European organisms rather than species that actually occur on their islands. And so the Academy set out to develop a curriculum that would feature the local biodiversity. And these education efforts focused on primary schools because tuition is free for primary school. And so there's wide enrollment across communities on both islands. And so it's the most effective way to reach the largest number of students. So in 2012, in partnership with local nonprofit organizations and educators, the Academy's team developed a coloring book that features endemic species and delivered them to about 2,000 third graders on both São Tomé and Príncipe Islands, along with a short presentation about how unique the island species are. And this was, for me, this was the first expedition that I joined, and I was still a graduate student at the time, and it was really formative to see firsthand how biodiversity researchers can seamlessly blend their research in a particular place with generating custom curricula to teach students about the incredible diversity in their backyards. So I found that super inspiring, and I feel really lucky that I get to continue moving this project forward because it's very unique in that sense. So in 2013, the team developed a deck of cards featuring São Tomé and Príncipe species, where the red suits featured Príncipe plants and animals, and the black suits featured São Tomé species. And this preview of the cards here doesn't show it, but the cards also included the local names for the species. And then the cards were delivered to the same set of students that were now fourth graders with a demo of a memory game classroom activity. And this was a lot of fun to participate in as well. In 2014, the team developed a biodiversity booklet for a more advanced fifth grade audience. And this booklet included more information about the biology of the species that are featured and also the geological history of the islands. So then in 2015, the education team started back in the third grade with a coloring book that features endemic birds. And each student also got a pair of binoculars and an in-class demonstration on how to use them. Then in 2016, the theme was coastal habitats. And so the team developed a poster that featured coastal habitats and different organisms in them. And the students received a booklet along with a hand lens and a demonstration on how to use a hand lens to look at coastal organisms up close. And then the following year, for the students that had reached the fifth grade, the team redesigned the playing cards to include a little bit more content about the species that were pictured on each card. And they also designed a botany poster for classrooms that featured local plants and also the basic anatomy of a flower. Again, featuring a flower that occurs on the islands that the students would be more familiar with. And then in 2018, the team started with another cohort of third graders, about 2,400 this time, and they updated the content of the original biodiversity coloring book. And this was the first time that the education team also delivered the program to 2 classes of students with hearing impairments, which is amazing because it's getting to the point now where the education program is really reaching almost every third grader. And so here the teacher's going through the textbook the coloring book, and you can see that there's a lot of animation in the front row because the students are excited. They're recognizing the famous Cobra Bobo Sicilian, which is featured on that particular page. So there's the Cobra Bobo, very famous. So although all these educational projects are really geared towards engaging the youngest generation, our team never passes up an opportunity to share what we're doing with adults too. So this is a group of construction workers who helped change a tire en route to a school. We're constantly getting flat tires in the field. And so right after they helped change the tire, and our team explained what we were up to, and so they're sharing the materials with this construction crew, and you can see they are also very engaged in the material. And because we go back every year under normal circumstances, we also get to see where the materials from the previous year end up. And so here's just a sampling of material several years later that is being featured in prominent places. And then in the bottom left, we have the Cobra Bobo patches. So the Cobra Bobo is sort of our mascot for the project, and we give out these patches to the teachers so they can hand them out to students when they've done excellent work. And we also hand them out to people that we work with, and you can see that years later, people are wearing them proudly. So it's always fun to see those patches out and about. And some very well-loved playing cards in the bottom right. Another really important aspect of this primary school education project is including local leadership and administrators in the process. So here's a photo from a meeting with the president, the former president of Príncipe, to show him the design of the first coloring book. And then after large presentations, or any time that we have a meeting with the president, we are interviewed often by the local television stations for the evening news. And so this gives us an opportunity to tell a large audience about the research and educational aims of the project. And it also means that Bob is basically a minor TV celebrity on the islands now after doing this for 20 years. And so this broad engagement has really paid off. Príncipe was recognized as a UNESCO Man and Biosphere Reserve. And so this is a program that recognizes sites with unique ecosystem level biodiversity and a really strong commitment from local communities to promote biodiversity conservation and sustainable socioeconomic development. And so we happen to be in Príncipe on the day of the induction ceremony. And so here's Bob posing with the president and the official certificate. And if you zoom in on the president's shirt, you can see that he's wearing one of the Cobra Bobo patches. So this is, I think, an amazing photo. And just a really amazing accomplishment for the entire team, and of course, for Príncipe and for the nation of São Tomé and Príncipe. So being recognized as a Man and Biosphere Reserve, which in the case of Príncipe Island includes the entire island and its surrounding waters, is a really important step towards conserving ecosystem level biodiversity. And as I alluded to earlier, one of the most pressing issues based on marine surveys is a need for marine protected areas and alternative protein sources and livelihoods for fishermen. Another really striking outcome of the collective efforts of the Academy and many others is the new currency that São Tomé and Príncipe printed, which rather than featuring notable people or buildings, features the animals that live on the islands. And only one of these depicts a non-native animal. The 100 Dobra bill shows the Mona monkey, which is a species that was introduced but you may recognize the São Tomé shrew and several endemic bird species. And then the 20 Dobra note is especially close to my heart. You may recognize not only the species, but the actual photo that they used is the one that I have been using in this presentation. So the São Tomé giant reed frog appears on the 20 Dobra note. A lot of our focus, as I've been sharing, has been engagement on São Tomé and Príncipe, but when possible, our team also works to increase global attention to the islands. So we regularly present at scientific conferences to share our discoveries with other biologists and hopefully to inspire them to pursue research on the islands, especially for groups of organisms that we know less about. And then we also contribute to popular media outlets as well when they're interested in covering our work. And so a couple years ago, we started to formalize our collaborations with colleagues who are also deeply invested in research, education, and conservation on the unique diversity of São Tomé and Príncipe. And we're in the process of registering as a nonprofit in São Tomé, and we have several exciting new projects in the works and some pretty ambitious long-term goals that I'll quickly share with you. So because many of our team members are ornithologists and bird watching is a very popular activity for ecotourists, one of the first projects is producing a comprehensive field guide of birds in English and in Portuguese. And another really important sort of publishing project is an edited volume on the biodiversity of the Gulf of Guinea with contributed chapters written by experts to summarize our current knowledge for most groups of organisms. And so we envision that this will be an essential reference for scholars and for conservation professionals and policymakers. And importantly, this book will be available for free as a digital download, and we're also working to have a fully translated version in Portuguese, which the publisher has agreed to. So making this information really widely accessible is important to us. Alongside these publishing projects, we will be continuing our work with local elementary schools, bringing new educational material each year and modifying some of the previous materials that we've developed. And using the biodiversity textbook as a launching point, we aim to provide more professionalized training for teachers and ultimately to collaboratively develop a comprehensive biology curriculum for primary school. So we're especially interested in developing more hands-on activities that teachers can implement with minimal equipment and leveraging accessible tools like iNaturalist, which is based at the Cal Academy. And then in the longer term, our goal is to rehabilitate an existing structure like this site on São Tomé to establish a biodiversity field research station. And we also envision having a satellite center in Príncipe. And so these centers would serve as a base to study island biodiversity and conservation, to be sort of a convening point for academics and students in São Tomé and abroad, as well as ecotourists. And the vision is that a portion of this space would be dedicated to public education, including natural history exhibits and classrooms and an auditorium, with the broader goal of further igniting and supporting the pursuit of biodiversity science in young people. Much like the Cal Academy, these centers would also house reference scientific collections for the plants, animals, and fungi of the islands, as well as a reference library. And the Botanical Garden on São Tomé Island already maintains a national herbarium and a living orchid collection. And so we would like to support them with additional funding and supplies to maintain this really important collection. And then finally, we aim to provide advanced training for local ecotourism guides, field assistants, and researchers to provide opportunities for career advancement. So I hope you've gotten a sense of what we've been up to since Bob initially pulled many of us along for this adventure and why we keep going back. It's been really important for us, and it's been really important for the communities that we work with as well. So again, thank you to all the donors and volunteers who have contributed to the Gulf of Guinea project, many of whom have continued to support this work over nearly 2 decades. And a special thank you to our expedition photographers whose images make it so much easier for us to share our work with the rest of the world. So if you'd like to keep up with our work, you can follow along at our website listed here. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
There are a ton of questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, if there are questions about non-frogs, I may not have many answers.
I know. I tried to prioritize the ones you could speak to. There were, obviously the people were interested in everything you showed, but also it was just that was such a cool presentation. I think it's so nice to get those reminders that biodiversity science at its best is not simply about putting things in a museum. It's really a living, growing thing that has real world impact and involves everybody who is involved. And so, yeah, I love that too. Just personally, it was great to see. Okay, I'll ask a bunch of questions and you can tell me if you have a hard stop or need to tap out at some point.
Okay.
So Andrea says, or asks, I heard you say new to science several times. Is that different than a new species?
Well, so I think generally, in most places in the world, especially places where humans live, someone has seen the species before. So we tend to not want to say that we discovered something or that something is new, but rather that it hasn't been documented in the scientific literature, just to acknowledge that there are other forms of knowledge other than has this been published in a scientific journal? And if not, it doesn't exist, or like it's completely unknown.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And it's something that I certainly believe that, but sometimes I slip up and I don't say it the way that I intend to. So.
Right. But it really gets at the fact that a lot of species that are new species or new to science have also been known by local peoples for hundreds of years and are not new at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And especially in the case of the reed frog on Príncipe Island, of course, everyone on Príncipe knows this frog. It's super abundant. It lives in their backyards. But it's more the genetic and like really detailed physical analysis that showed that it was different from the São Tomé species. And so it would be ridiculous for me to say that I discovered this new species and that it wasn't known, because of course it was known. It's just a different way of categorizing or classifying life that scientists use. So.
Right. And documenting it formally is so integral to those protections that you mentioned.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great. Sylvie says, this was incredible. Thank you. Are these islands set up for tourism? I'm wondering if we would be helping or not helping by trying to visit.
So tourism is definitely possible. And it's certainly, there are major efforts, sort of grassroots and also more formally from the government to encourage ecotourism. And of course, right now, none of us can really envision traveling anywhere. But in general, yes, they're amazing islands to visit. And absolutely, I encourage you to go there, especially if you're interested in biodiversity. They have really beautiful beaches too, and you can just have a really relaxing, beautiful stay. There's some really nice ecotourism lodges that you can stay in as well if you want a more rustic experience. But in terms of the biodiversity, it's just really, really spectacular. A lot of really unusual species that you wouldn't see elsewhere. But I would say the main barrier is that it's a Portuguese-speaking country. And so for many people, it might be a little bit more challenging to visit if you don't speak Portuguese. Or and like if you speak, I don't really speak much Portuguese, but I speak French and some Spanish, and so I can get by. But that can be a barrier for travelers for sure.
Okay. JC says, I just want to say thank you for introducing me to the phrase kleptoparasite. And Ricky asked, do you know whether there are any freshwater fish species on the island?
There are, but not very many. Okay. And yeah, they're like mud skippers.
Oh, yeah.
So there might be others too, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Okay. Jen would like to know, how giant is the giant tree frog?
So the giant tree frog that I showed at the very beginning is actually quite giant. The females are maybe like about this big.
Yeah.
The giant reed frog, who I talked about in the middle of the talk, is only about like this big. It's just that reed frogs on average are not that big. So for a reed frog, it's very big.
Okay, relative to the rest of it. Got it.
Yeah, but the giant tree frog is quite striking for how giant it is.
Yeah, I was surprised when you showed it briefly in an earlier presentation, so maybe people should Google if they really want to get a sense. Kara asks, can you go over how you know the reed frogs didn't island jump? What if the reed frogs that were on the island closest to the mainland went extinct, while the ones on São Tomé and Príncipe did not?
Yeah, so that is absolutely possible. And the reason that we don't think that that's the case is because the closest populations are, they're not that distantly related. So for extinction over longer periods of time becomes more and more likely a cause of unusual patterns that we see in terms of where species are found. And if you see a really unexpected relationship between species that are really geographically distant, then it's very natural to think that there must have been species or populations in between connecting them that have since gone extinct. But in this case, there's not that much evolutionary time separating them where that seems to be highly likely. But it's always a possibility, and we will never know for sure unless we find a fossil or something on that island that confirms the alternative hypothesis. But yeah, absolutely. With a lot of these things, there are other possible explanations, and we just move forward with the one that is best supported by the data that we have at this moment in time.
Yeah, it's such a cool form of puzzle solving.
It definitely feels like puzzle solving, yes.
Yeah. I'm going to get this one in from Michelle M. Sun, who would like to know if you have any pets personally.
I do. I have a cat who's been sleeping next to me very quietly.
No amphibian.
No amphibian pets. Amphibians are pretty hard to keep. They just need really specific conditions. And we have some amazing biologists at the Academy who maintain some colonies of frogs for display and also some behind the scenes. And so I can get my frog fix by walking around the museum or hanging out with the aquarium biologists and let them do all the work. But yeah, I'm definitely missing being able to see frogs at the Academy and also being able to go to the field, which I haven't been able to do for a while. So
yeah. Okay. So Kevin is curious. He asked, do you think something changed about the currents or environment to make it so that there aren't any paths for frogs back and forth between the two islands anymore?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's a part of the puzzle that I would say I don't have a good answer to yet, which is how did species disperse between the islands if there's animals or plants that aren't good at dispersing in general. So I think this rafting hypothesis from big rivers, people have seen rafts leaving these rivers, and in the Amazon, people have actually intercepted rafts that they've seen and surveyed to see what's on them. And there are snakes and lizards and frogs and all kinds of stuff on there. So that sort of is a little bit more convincing that this isn't just a crazy explanation for what might have happened. But it doesn't really explain dispersal between the islands because there aren't huge rivers on these islands. There are rivers for sure, but not huge ones that we would think as like having this massive freshwater discharge and big rafts being swept out. So I don't have a good explanation for how that would have happened. And certainly the currents do shift over time. So there's also that possibility as well.
Cool. Let's see, I'll take 3 more. Jake asks, if you were bit by the cobra you showed, would it be fatal? Do scientists carry antivenom, or how comprehensive is the first aid kit that you would take on a trip like this?
So most likely, yes, it would be very bad to be envenomated by that snake. Fortunately, they're not very aggressive. Most venomous snakes are not. So as long as you just watch where you're walking and give them plenty of space, you're not going to have a problem. We do not carry antivenin in the field, and there are multiple reasons for that. The first is that antivenins are really specific to the venom composition of a species. So in São Tomé, there's only one venomous snake, so you would at least know what you need to bring, but many of the other places that we work have several different types of venomous snakes, and so you'd have to bring a whole suite of antivenins with you. But also antivenins are perishable and they have to be kept cold, and we just don't have the ability to do that in the field.
Right.
So I have not yet found out what the medical offerings are for treatment in São Tomé. Although I will say I had the unfortunate experience of stepping on a sea urchin
Oh God.
on one trip, and yeah, it was brutal.
Yeah.
I don't recommend that.
Yeah.
So
I've only heard. Yeah.
Sea urchin encounters and not venomous snake encounters in my work.
Right. You still get a courage badge for that though. That's pretty serious.
It was bad.
Yeah. Jan asks, can you compare or contrast the use of frog songs to the use of bird songs in understanding taxonomy / speciation? Are frog songs completely innate or are they learned?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So frog songs are not learned, and they tend to be a lot more simple in structure. There are species that have sort of a repertoire or like different songs for different occasions, similar to a lot of birds. But as far as we know, those are not learned from a tutor, and they don't have as many complex elements generally as bird songs do. So in some ways that makes them a little bit easier to study, especially from a taxonomic perspective, because you don't have this sort of blurring of lines of like which part of the song is genetic or inherited versus which part is learned, like you do in birds, which can kind of make it tricky to trace back the ancestry. But it also maybe makes them a little bit less interesting to study because they're a little bit simpler.
Because you put your volume button in the wrong place.
I know. I should have tested that.
Whatever. It was fantastic. And let's see. This last question is from Sergey, and they ask: are the amphibians on these islands protected from chytrid because they're so isolated? And do we have a way to immunize species against that yet?
Yeah. So I had a slide on chytrid and I decided to take it out because, there's enough bad news in the world these days.
Yeah.
But yeah, so unfortunately, the chytrid fungus, which is a fungal pathogen that is causing declines in amphibians all around the world, but it's impacting different species and different populations more strongly than others. So we do know that it's present in São Tomé and Príncipe, and because we have museum collections going back to 2001, we've surveyed those, and so we know that the fungus has been there since at least 2001, but we don't have collections that are older than that we can survey. So in many parts of the world now, biologists have been able to sort of document when the fungus would have been introduced to just get a better understanding of how new is this pathogen, and does that potentially explain why certain species are responding so negatively to it arriving, because they just sort of haven't evolved with that pathogen, and so they don't have any resistance. So we know that it's been there for at least 20 years. And then more recently, some colleagues were able to get some of the DNA sequence of the fungal pathogen from these swabs from our museum specimens. So like time machine style, like what was the genome of the pathogen that was present on these islands 20 years ago, which is super cool.
Yeah.
And it looks like it is the sort of spreading, more serious version of this fungal pathogen. So in some parts of the world, it looks like the fungus has been present for a long time, and it's sort of less virulent or like less deadly.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that we found in São Tomé and Príncipe looks like it is kind of the more scary one. But but we haven't seen or heard of major die-offs. So we don't really know what the situation is, but we're continuing to monitor it. And one thing that's also kind of interesting is that the Sicilian species also has infection with this pathogen. And so in general, we've known that Sicilians can also be infected, but again, because they tend to be less frequently encountered, there isn't as much information about infection rates in Sicilians and how sensitive they are to the pathogen. So yeah, everybody has it, but we don't know if it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you thinking of our mental health and happiness and in advance. Yeah, I mean, overall, this was really such a brilliant presentation to see, and just such a good story overall, and such a nice overview of what really like inclusive real world science looks like, and the kind of science that we like to do at the Academy and lots of other institutions as well. So thank you. And I think you once referenced coming back to do something on frog vision, perhaps. So
that is, yeah, I owe you that.
Okay.
I did do a short nightlife on just some very basics of frog vision, but yes.
I know. I was
convinced to do more.
Okay. Well, we can drop the nightlife one in there for starters, but would love to have you back. And let's see here. So end of show notes. I was going to say, viewers, please join us tonight, right back here at 7 p.m. Pacific, for a really special event, which is the Far and Wild virtual event. And this is basically a celebration of this year's winners of our annual Big Picture Natural World Photography Competition. So it is a chance to see work from some of the most incredible nature and wildlife photographers active today. So I would recommend not missing it. As always, if you are able to comfortably give to support the Academy, we'd be really, really grateful. We've been closed for 6 months now and are really fighting to protect our staff and our research and the museum itself. So any help or new members is deeply appreciated. But if not, no worries at all. We're just glad to have you join us for programs like these. And yeah, so thank you, viewers. Thank you to all the members watching today. And huge thanks again to Rayna for giving us your morning. And we'll see you back here tonight, hopefully at 7. Take care, everybody.
Bye. Bye.